Oh, thanks for joining us again. My name is Dan Meyer. I'm editor-in-chief for RCR Wireless News, and now we are joined by Larry Hettick, who's the principal analyst at Webtorials, to talk a bit about the ever-evolving telecom network and looking towards cloud and NFV and all this great stuff that's happening in the network. But hey, Larry, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Great, my pleasure.
Great.
Before we begin with some of my predictions for next year,
Yes.
I'd like to kind of look at a snapshot of where we've been this year with several different areas. I want to start with Webrtc.
Okay.
Webrtc is a web-based real-time communications protocol that allows users to communicate, essentially bypassing a lot of applications. It's web browser to web browser, and it's a standard that's been supported actively by Google and others. Where we find Webrtc, interestingly enough, is being very heavily supported by enterprises in addition to Google. And so we did a survey back this year and last year as well, and found out that almost half of enterprises, including small, medium, and large businesses, either had used Webrtc or were planning to use it within the next 12 months. And the biggest places for that to happen were in video and for contact center solutions. So Webrtc as a protocol is being supported actively on a browser-to-browser basis. And why that's important is, we'll come back to it when we get to predictions. But but one of the biggest issues around Webrtc also is to be able to communicate externally with your customers, so customers don't have to download an application on their phone, for example. And that's especially important in contact center solutions. So we'll go on to the next slide and talk a little bit about Volte. The other thing that was kind of interesting this year was the first year we did a study on Volte, and we asked both service providers and enterprises where they were. Now, granted, most of our responses were from service providers in North America and Western Europe, but we found that of those service providers globally, 65% were actually offering live Volte services, which was kind of surprising. 26% were in field trials. And then we also asked them a question about Volte to Wi-Fi. So, for example, voice over Wi-Fi and the ability to roam between. And 75% of carriers plan to support that, but again, we'll come back to the future and whether or not that's actually happening or not. We asked the enterprise some questions around Volte. You know, normally you would think that enterprises wouldn't really care about what the technology is in the background. They just want it to work. But almost 80% of enterprises wanted to see Volte support their enterprise mobility strategy, and they saw Volte as a key to doing that. They thought that it was important to deploy not only for the ability to provide enterprise mobility, but especially to be able to integrate with the hosted unified communication services that the carriers are offering. So carriers really have just in the last few years started to offer hosted UC, cloud-based UC. So being able to integrate Volte with both with UC was also pretty important.
Okay. All right.
Next, we took a look at the enterprise mobility market, and this is a survey that we've not released the results yet, but it'll be coming out in the next few weeks. So
it's a teaser right here.
Yeah, it's a teaser for our survey that's coming out. But enterprise mobility was being deployed quite extensively. However, 38% of those who were surveyed said that access to the applications and content they needed outside the office did not meet their needs. So we kind of dug a little deeper to see what that meant in terms of dollars. And we looked at three categories of workers. We looked at knowledge workers, information workers, and service workers. Knowledge workers being the most likely to use enterprise mobility, and also some of the highest paid. And we looked at Bureau of Labor Statistics salaries and found out that because of that deficiency, that 38% deficiency, that the average knowledge worker was losing about $12,000 a year in lost productivity time because they weren't being fully supported by enterprise mobility. So that was kind of interesting this year. We expect that to change over time as enterprise mobility becomes more available. Three most important enterprise mobility apps included document sharing, collaboration, audio conferencing, and then mobile clients for smartphones. We also discovered that mobile device management was pretty important to that strategy as well.
I think that's a great part. Actually, the slide is really interesting because, again, you did bring in some of the numbers from the Bureau of Labor Statistics and kind of really provided more color on just a typical number, which is very interesting, which I think drives home the point like you guys are trying to make, that this is important. I mean, this is actually a dollar amount, not just a percentage figure. It's a dollar amount.
And the other interesting part was that service workers, normally you would think, for example, housekeepers or someone that is in the service industry, restaurant folks, flight attendants in the service business, you wouldn't normally think of those as being required to use enterprise mobility, but indeed they do. They use it for emails, for corporate information, for scheduling, and so forth. So there is some lost productivity there if that doesn't happen.
Yeah, very interesting, very interesting. Well, great. Well, now let's move along to a little bit of the looking ahead part of this year. Now, obviously, we're here into 2015 and 2016 now. What are you guys seeing,
Sure.
I guess, in terms of some of these big movements here?
We actually have a survey in the field right now. It's
Okay.
ongoing, so people are still answering questions here. But we've asked a couple questions around the telco transition, and there's a lot happening in the telcos. Telcos are, wireless providers are moving to 4G LTE. Wireline providers are putting in optical for broadband.
Yeah.
And both wireless and wireline providers are moving to a cloud-based data center kind of infrastructure.
Yeah.
And while that's something that they want to do, we found that they're at least 5 years away from having the majority of their network as being provided from an SDN software-defined network or a cloud-based infrastructure. So that was, even though there's a lot of talk about that, a lot of hype about it, we're still probably at least half a decade away from that happening.
Yeah.
We also asked the enterprise IT managers in the same survey what cloud services they expected from the service provider to be supported. And interestingly, if you combine agree and strongly agree, they absolutely wanted to have voice over IP and Volte supported from the cloud. They wanted unified communications. They wanted video conferencing, collaboration applications, going back to the enterprise mobility that we talked about earlier, network security, and a surprising number want contact center services. So 83% when you combine the two want to see hosted contact center available from the cloud as part of that transition strategy.
Interesting. And it's just, those top four that are all kind of basically IP-based type of things, it's really, it seems like that technology is out there. It's really not, obviously you have to kind of package things correctly, but it seems like that stuff is available and should be something that could be actually offered.
And in fact, if you look at how that's being provided right now, these services are all being offered by the service providers.
Yeah.
However, they're kind of a service per box.
Yeah.
So you've got your VoIP service or your voice switching service. You've got your unified communication server over here. You've got some magic collaboration app that works together with some of the other UC things and security. But the enterprise expects the cloud to be able to use these and offer the kinds of benefits that SDN-based infrastructure supplies, so the ability to be elastic, the ability to meet ongoing demand, and also to offer it in a way that works well with what the enterprise is doing inside their own networks. So I think that's an important thing as well.
And you think we're going to see some progress in that in 2016? Because I know like AT&T, for instance, has been doing a lot with their SDN program, and they've been talking a lot about enterprise as a main focus for them. Do you think 2016 will see some traction? Obviously, I know you said we're still looking 5 years out at least before we see broader, but
I think
seeing some?
And we asked some questions. We don't have enough numbers to support the results, but but we asked them, are you doing this kind of a service at a time? Are you doing this a geography at a time? Are you doing this kind of a network element at a time? So for example, are you doing all your UC? I think probably UC will be the first service that gets deployed in the cloud because there are already cloud-based UC services available, not only from companies like AT&T and Verizon, but companies like Microsoft.
Yeah, exactly.
And Google.
Yep.
But there are other elements that also have to go along in this transition because everyone thinks about the carriers as having this big infrastructure for switching and services, but they also have a back office.
Yes.
So all their provisioning systems, all their inventory systems, all their billing systems, those have to undergo the transition at the same time.
Yeah.
So it's a massive, massive undertaking for them that's kind of going concurrently with their upgrade to broadband infrastructure.
Yeah.
So there's a lot going on in the carriers
and like you
days.
said too, they're doing their LTE upgrades, looking at 5G. I mean, there's so much going on their plates right now.
Exactly.
But this is all part of it, but you're right, that's a lot of work that they've got coming ahead. So, okay. All right, let's look at the next slide here.
So let me kind of look at some of the predictions that I'm going to suggest.
Okay.
I think we're going to continue to see upgrades to the wired and the wireless broadband infrastructures, not only for traditional carriers, but it's interesting, Google Fiber has come in.
Yeah.
The cable providers are upgrading their infrastructures to gigabit services for the consumer and small business. So those are available in price points of below $100 for gigabit connectivity on the downstream side. On the wireless side, obviously LTE is still going to continue. We're seeing some initial kind of lab tests and field trials of 5G. That's going to move forward. That will also continue to grow the wireless infrastructure and the ability to provide the broadband that we require. So I think those upgrades are going to continue forward. Not really anything revolutionary, just kind of a more of the same where we're going.
In 2016.
In 2016,
Okay,
right. Although it's interesting because AT&T announced, 100 plus new cities for their new gigabit fiber service.
Gigabit service,
And I think a lot of that, frankly, is because Google has kind of pushed them into it, and the cable operators, I do expect in 2016 to see a lot of gigi services or gigabit services from the cable operators based on DOCSIS evolution and where they are now.
Yeah.
So the cable providers are going to start putting those kinds of services in place.
Makes sense. Yeah, there's definitely a lot of overlap when you look at some of the footprints that they're trying to do. AT&T and Google are definitely in a lot of same markets, and they're doing their gigabit stuff.
Right.
So, yeah, interesting. Yeah, okay, got it.
And I think we're also going to see some significant progress towards retiring PSTN and SS7 networks. AT&T has said that by 2020 they pretty much want to unplug the PSTN and the SS7 network and replace that all with an IP-based, fiber-based infrastructure. I don't know if they're going to quite make that. It's pretty ambitious.
Yeah.
But we are seeing all the major tier 1 carriers, CenturyLink, Verizon, AT&T on the wireline side, take significant moves on a city-by-city or geography by location basis to actually replace their PSTN switching with fiber-based, IP-based infrastructures that provide them a lot more flexibility for the voice network.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that'll be a tricky one. That's obviously it's regulatory issues, and I know we can get down to that a little later, but that's going to be tricky.
Yeah.
So,
I think we're going to see slow and steady progress on the service provider side, transition to what they want to move away from the telco switching model to more data service model. And again, that's going to happen both on their OSS, BSS in the back office and on their network side for network services. Again, I'm not sure if they're going to do that on a geography by geography basis. Some of that, for example, particularly in the back office, they have to do it system-wide. You can't just turn on, for example, Austin, you can't just turn on inventory systems just for Austin very easily outside of a trial. So.
Yeah, sure. Okay.
I think we're also going to see continued regulatory activity this year. I think, this 2014, 2015 set up big battle lines for net neutrality.
Yes.
And that's going to go through the courts.
Yeah.
The FCC still left a lot of unanswered questions as to how they're going to regulate around net neutrality. There's a whole host of services. For example, if AT&T wants to offer toll-free Netflix, is that going to be allowed under net neutrality regulations? Don't know. The FCC certainly didn't get to that level of detail in their regulation. If we look at where video is going in terms of enterprise private IP networks, that's a service that we can already control the class of service for, so we can guarantee the outcome and the quality of the service. Is that same kind of thing going to be offered as carriers move from not only offering voice communications, but point-to-point, peer-to-peer video communications? Is that a service that can be controlled like we control the voice networks? Don't know.
Yeah.
Lots of unanswered questions in that area. The other thing that I think we're going to see, and for the first time in 2015, the FCC came down and said, okay, carriers, we know you're moving toward this optical SDN environment. You're going to unplug the PSTN. That's fine, but don't unplug any of the services you've got. And I don't know how realistic that is. At some point, we have to say grandma's rotary dial is not going to work anymore.
Yeah.
Kind of like, at some point, the FCC said, yes, we can get rid of those hand crank operator phones that were a party line, and yes, we can go to rotary dial.
Yeah.
But that's not always an easy transition for regulators to make.
And it seems like it's getting probably more and more difficult. I mean, it seems like by the year, there's more and more attention put on that kind of stuff too. So it seems like as we kind of progress, it's becoming a bigger issue. So yeah, at some point it's going to be tackled.
Yes.
That's going to be a tough.
And the FCC has already said that they're going to they're going to be more explicit about both net neutrality and answering some of these questions, and the regulation as we move forward into
2017.
Yeah, into transitions.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, all right.
So let's take a look at the next set of predictions.
Okay.
We've already seen hosted UC services. We've seen double-digit growth in hosted UC services versus a premise-based solution. I think if we haven't already reached critical mass for those services, we will see that, where more people are using unified communications as opposed to, and that includes voice over IP, by the way, and all the things that go with that. I think we're going to reach the point where there are more people using that than not in the enterprise.
Okay.
I think same thing on the consumer side. As we move to Volte, Volte is actually a voice over IP service. It's voice on the data channel, so that's technically also a kind of a unified communications portfolio.
Yep.
It's also going to be interesting as Microsoft moves forward with Skype for Business. They've been very aggressive with that. They have actually replaced, in some cases, IP PBXs, hosted UC services with a complete Microsoft solution. And they offer that both as a hosted service, a premise-based service, and now a virtual service based on some stuff that's just come out recently. And they're going to do battle with Google. You know, I know, for example, when you send something to Larry at Webtorials.com, it's actually going to a Gmail server.
Yep.
And I use Google Docs and Google Calendar and all those kinds of things. So a lot of small and mid-sized businesses have already turned to companies like Google to offer those kinds of UC services.
Is that exactly the battle? Because it does seem like Google has got a really good footprint into the small and mid-size, and Microsoft has the large ones. I mean, is there going to be kind of that
I think
a battleground there?
Part of the reason Microsoft has a foothold in the larger enterprises is because the cost of what used to be Microsoft Link and now Skype for Business was actually much more cost-effective for a larger enterprise.
Yeah.
But as they host these services and they go to virtual environments, it has become cost-effective if you look at Office 65 as a solution for small to medium business. So I think there's going to be a battlefield going on there with Google.
Yeah.
WebRTC also plays into that. You know, Microsoft has something that works with WebRTC, but it's not exactly WebRTC, and they've got a gateway that works between, and Google's supporting WebRTC, and Microsoft says they will support it, but now they're just going to interoperate with it. So these carriers and outside providers are not necessarily working as closely as they could to make all this real easy for an enterprise. I think WebRTC will continue to be enterprise-centric. We've seen a huge number of small, medium, and large businesses turn to WebRTC-based applications. You know, if you look, for example, Amazon Mayday, or if you look at Contact Center, or I saw one the other day where a large hospital chain is going to use WebRTC for remote telemedicine, so that they can interact between doctor and patient and not have to worry about applications residing at the customer's site to talk to the doctors. I think this is going to be controlled pretty much from an enterprise perspective to start. The carriers have not yet, except for Telefonica and some other trials that are going on in Europe, the carriers are pretty much still sitting on the sidelines for this. I don't see them offering these as a mainstream portfolio service probably for several years.
Yeah, I feel like they're still relying, I think, are waiting for Volte to kind of be maybe their solution when it comes to maybe packaging that stuff together to an extent. But who knows? I mean, I guess you know, it's still, it's like we're early in that process. So
yeah, and I think, you know, talking about Volte, Volte first of all relies on LTE being deployed.
Sure, yeah.
So if we look globally, there are a lot of pockets where LTE has not been deployed. We did a survey, the survey we did on Volte last year. You know, for example, there are pockets in Asia and Africa where you know, they're happy to have 3G, let alone Volte. So they're a long ways away from that. I think in North America, we're going to start seeing not quite critical mass, not quite 50%, but I see, you know, 20, 30% of service areas having Volte coverage nationwide. Roaming between those is still an issue.
Yeah, big issue.
You know, sometimes roaming within the same carrier network is a big issue.
True.
Let alone roaming between, for example, Verizon and Sprint and AT&T and T-Mobile. That's
I mean, I know they've talked a little bit about getting some agreements together, at least enabling that, but that's still a process.
So we're a ways away from that. And not unlike when we, you know, had roaming. In fact, to this day, we still don't have roaming between, for example, a Verizon network and an AT&T network because they use different technology platforms.
Exactly. But even like this, like text messaging, interoperability between text messaging.
It took a long time to get that fixed.
Now it's like a common thing, but exactly.
I think Volte and the rest of the world is going to depend on the LTE infrastructure. One of the big drivers behind Volte is to free up the spectrum that you were using for 3G voice, so that you can reallocate that to 4G LTE. And as carriers move to 4G LTE, they don't really want to maintain those 3G voice networks because they want to take that spectrum and use it for Volte and other data services, much more efficient way to do that. So
the refarming of that spectrum is very important. Okay, all right.
I want to talk for a moment about voice over Wi-Fi.
Big one.
This is a big deal, I think, especially in the U.S. If you look, for example, at Comcast, you know, Comcast has millions of Xfinity hotspots. Last summer, I was in the Bay Area in Northern California, and I had business all the way from San Jose up to San Francisco. and I was never out of range of an Xfinity hotspot.
Wow.
You know, at the ballpark, at the shopping mall, at the movie theaters, and the restaurants and residential areas and business parks, everywhere I could see Xfinity hotspots.
Mm-hmm.
Now, a couple things happening here. One is the cable companies are giving away their, or I should say their packaging, they're not giving it away, it's not free.
Nothing for us, yeah.
They're packaging their Wi-Fi services with their broadband wireline bundles.
Yep.
So if you become a Comcast Xfinity broadband subscriber, you have access to Comcast Xfinity hotspots.
Yep.
And that's kind of automatic, it comes with the service.
Yep.
This is dipping into the pockets of the mobile operators on the data side, absolutely. But outside of, for example, Cablevision in the New York area, the cable providers have been really reluctant to use Wi-Fi as a voice-over service, a mainstream voice-over service. Sure, they've got apps just like we've got Skype and Vonage and so forth that work, but actually to be able to transition to do that, I think there are several issues that come into play here. One is the ability to roam between Wi-Fi hotspots. The technology exists to do that, provided you have a back office that allows you to authorize the handoff, kind of like when we authorize when we do cellular roaming, same thing happens. That may or may not be in place for all these providers. The bigger issue is roaming between voice over Wi-Fi and voice over LTE. The technology exists again to be able to do that. And in fact, enterprises do that all the time. T-Mobile does that in their network. You know, if you're a T-Mobile subscriber with a smartphone, you use voice over Wi-Fi at home, and when you leave your home access network, then you're back on the T-Mobile commercial radio network. So, but what will be interesting is to see how willing companies like AT&T and Verizon are willing to work with Comcast or the other cable providers who are taking money out of their data pocket to work with them and say, hey, you know what? No problem. You want to roam from voice over Wi-Fi onto our cellular network or 4G LTE network or Volte network? Not a problem. I think those issues still need to be resolved, including issues like compensation for roaming. Those agreements are already in place for LTE to LTE networks, but they're not in place for voice over Wi-Fi. So,
those are big companies going head to head. I mean, I can see maybe like a cable company, like a smaller carrier, like a T-Mobile or Sprint, who perhaps aren't quite as aggressively competing against each other. But against the big guys especially, I think that's going to be tough to see those guys working together.
And you got to remember too that Comcast and AT&T and Verizon are all competing already on the wireline side for TV, for broadband, for
security,
voice services, home security, absolutely.
So
these guys compete in other markets, and they're not always the best of friends.
Exactly. Yeah.
So I'm going to talk also about video momentum. I've been saying for the last 2 or 3 years that I think that by the year 2020, we're going to see more video minutes than voice minutes on our networks. We've already seen, as a measure of capacity, video has already overwhelmed voice and data as a predominant application riding over networks. I think we're getting to the point where we're going to see more point-to-point, FaceTime, Skype, video conferencing, where we're going to see more video minutes and voice minutes. And I think probably most of the engineers and the telcos, the wireless carriers would agree as well.
Yeah, and they've done a lot. I mean, I think we've already seen some of the AT&T Verizon guys at least looking at LTE broadcast as an option for them to kind of offload some traffic there. I know with T-Mobile, they're doing their binge on service, which is basically a software that they're using to kind of measure or at least control the video traffic over their network too. So it looks like they're at least trying to put things in place to control it. Because I think, obviously, like you said, they realize that video traffic is, I think we talked about earlier, is the number one thing of traffic on the network is video. Then it's data, and then it's voice. And that video part is just growing and growing. So.
And there is some factors I think that are also going to affect the adoption of video. One is real-time communications. We saw in our survey for Webrtc that video and contact center were the 2 biggest applications folks wanted to use that for in the enterprise. The other thing is from a regulatory perspective, going back to the question about net neutrality. Right now the FCC has said in their ruling pretty clearly that if you want to manage your voice over an IP network as a priority service, that's okay. That's cool by net neutrality rules. Don't know if that applies to video. Don't know if that applies to video conferencing, if that applies to FaceTime, for example. And whether or not that gets decremented from your data bucket or not is another question that we still
sponsored data, things like that. And what's
sponsored
going to
data.
happen there? Exactly. Yeah,
Right.
That's going to be a big challenge. Yeah, right. It seems like on the regulatory side, the FCC is going to be very busy trying to clarify a lot of points because
Right.
things are exploding so quickly in terms of services that are available, and IP is making so many things possible. And the FCC is trying to take a somewhat of a hands-off approach to an extent, but they're going to need some clarifications on a
Right.
lot of things, which is
Right.
going to be courts, challenges, things like that too.
Exactly.
So that's going to
Yeah.
be big in 2016. So.
Yeah.
Interesting insight. Well, hey, Larry, thanks again for the great insight on it. Obviously, a lot going to happen in 2016 and beyond. I think we'll be maybe getting back here a year from now and talking about what happened and then looking ahead until 2017.
Look to see how we did with the predictions
Yeah,
a year from
exactly.
now.
I'm going to keep all these and put them in concrete
there
to
you
make
go.
sure we don't lose these. But
All right.
yeah, we'll check them out again next year. But hey, again, Larry, thanks so much for the time. We appreciate it.
Thanks again. My pleasure.
All right.
Thank you.
Sounds good. All right. That'll do it. Thanks for watching.